So we can go ahead. Perfect. So welcome. My name is Katie Andrews. I am a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and corporate wellness expert. I'm also, would not call myself a home chef. I'm going to call myself a home cook, but I am someone who spends a lot of time in my kitchen. Welcome to my home. This is my beautiful kitchen. Spend a lot of time in here cooking recipes for my family, recipes for my clients, recipes for when I'm trying to develop new items and dishes. So the theme for today, we really wanted to kind of play off a little bit on the upcoming everyone's favorite upcoming Irish holiday. Tried to find something green. I have my beautiful bright green shoes on that you sadly can't see, but I thought this made me feel a little bit Irish, this top today. So we're going to be making brown soda scones. As you can see in the Smitten Kitchen link, she calls it Castle Breakfast because Deb, who runs that website, taken a large trip with her family, and they were staying at these castles in Ireland. And every morning, one of the features of the beautiful breakfast spread they were given were these delicious, fantastic Irish wholemeal scones. And so when she came back, as a recipe developer and blogger does, she tried to recreate them in her kitchen, and that is what we are going to be doing today. So you have the recipes. If you're cooking along, or if you happen to have the ingredients, you can preheat your oven now to 375 degrees. I have mine preheating. So we're going to be using some magic of cooking online today, where I'm going to show you how to make these, but then I'm also going to be able to show you a complete set of them that have already baked and cooled a little bit. So you can put questions into the chat. We can't take you off mute, but if you have a question as we're going, I will be sure to glance at the chat, and I will also check the chat at the very end. I will also repost the recipes at the end just in case. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. And again, welcome to my kitchen. So scones, baked goods, pastries, donuts, these are typically thought of as not necessarily very healthful foods. And first of all, any food can fit into a healthy breakfast. I love an almond croissant personally. I don't waste my time with things from Starbucks, right? I want to go to the real traditional, fantastic French bakery. But scones are something that can be delicious also. I think where scones don't get the same lovely reputation as things like croissants is that they're often not prepared properly. And so they can be really dense and hard and almost like a rock. And that's what we really want to avoid. Additionally, traditional American scones are often made with just regular white all-purpose flour, and they just don't get the same nuttiness and density that the original Irish scones, or almost like Irish soda bread, has. And that's what we're really looking to recreate today. Now, what can be tricky about this is the fact that we're trying to recreate a food that is made with ingredients that we don't necessarily have here in the US. So if you have access to Irish wholemeal flour, fantastic. The difference generally is in American flour. So I've got two of my flours out here that we're going to be using today. But American flour, as you probably know, is milled very fine. So it's like a very, very thin powder, very easy to work with. It integrates well with other ingredients. But when you're trying to create scones, that's not actually what you want, right? Very different than making, let's say, a cake. What you're looking to do is actually add these ingredients to one another so that it creates some almost like air pockets within it. And that's what gives scones their nice outside crunchy texture, but their pillowiness inside. Now, it can be very difficult to find Irish wholemeal flour in the US. Even if you do, recipe developers will say that it's often ground down further than they would like. I'm going to turn another light on here. Just give, there we go, a little bit more brightness. So what we have done here is we've taken multiple different other ingredients and flours and mixed them together to recreate Irish wholemeal flour. And that's what I'm going to teach you guys to do right now. There we go. That lighting is looking much better. So anytime you're making a recipe where you're baking, you always want to start with a large bowl. Like, I can't tell you how many times I work with clients and they take out, a soup bowl or something small. It's better to have more space. It's not more work to wash it. So you want to be able to really integrate your ingredients to one another. You need space to do that. So start with your nice, big, largest mixing bowl. I have a set of Pyrex ones, but honestly, I like using these plasticky ones the most. They're very easy to use and easy to clean. You can also pour from them. So we're going to start by recreating our Irish wholemeal flour. In order to do that, we're going to mix a combination of 3 ingredients. And here's where I wanted to give you a couple different recipes because it may be difficult to find one or more of these ingredients. So we're going to be mixing some whole wheat flour. This happens to be organic, but you don't have to use organic. With some wheat germ. You'll find this typically in your baking aisle. And then ideally in Deb's recipe in Smitten Kitchen, we'd be using wheat bran, but I had a heck of a time trying to find wheat bran. You can order it online, but I don't love ordering shelf-stable food products online personally. And the store that I usually get it from didn't have it. So knowing, the purpose of the wheat bran is to add some texture and grittiness, I decided that we can substitute that with some flaxseed meal. So this is something I always have on hand. I use it for smoothies. I put it on yogurt bowls. I put it in oatmeal. It's really, anytime I bake for my kids and I want to add some protein or some healthy fat, flaxseed is fantastic for that. Also great sources, both of these, of fiber as well. So that's what kind of makes these scones. It gives them their nuttiness and richness, but also it makes them a little bit healthier, less refined flour in there. So you have 2 grams of fiber per serving in here and 3 grams of fiber per serving in here. Doesn't sound like a lot, but we need for women about 25 grams of fiber per day. For men, it's closer to 38. So any little ways that you can get some fiber in, most of us fall short of those requirements. So we're going to start with creating the flour. So first we get our cup measures here. We need 3/4 of a cup of the wheat germ. So since we're baking, we're doing more of science. I wouldn't use your big cup measure and just eyeball it to 3/4. I would really use your 1/4 cup measure and get that measurement to be really specific. So I'm going to put in 3/4, fill this up 3 times. Again, this wheat germ is a plant-based protein. It also contains fiber. It also is a great source of vitamins A and E. So it really makes these scones nice and healthy. So we've got 3/4 of a cup of wheat germ. Perfect. I'm going to close that up. And this, a little bit unique about wheat germ, it should be refrigerated after you open it. That's because of the fat content that it contains. So I'm going to put this over here. And then we're going to add in our whole wheat flour. So again, you can use organic. You don't have to use organic. And we need 1/2 cup of whole wheat flour. So I'm going to use my 1/4 measurement again. And I'm going to show you, seen this method before. I'm going to kind of level this off with my knife to make sure we're getting 2 even 1/4 cups to make a 1/2 cup. So there's 1. And let's bring in our second here. Beautiful. So we're going to be doing a mixture of whole wheat and white flour. This isn't going to be all whole wheat flour, but having the combination is what really makes this nice and balanced. So then we need a 1/4 cup of our wheat bran. And like I said, we're going to be using ground flax instead. Put this flour over there. So a 1/4 cup of ground flax. Very easy to scoop this up. You can actually use the side of your bag here if you don't have a knife to make sure you're getting a nice even measurement. Okay, so what you've done here is you've made Irish wholemeal flour. Now, if you were, let's say, to want to recreate these scones often, my advice to you to cut down on these steps would be to make this Irish wholemeal flour, and then you can store it in a jar just like this, and you've got it ready to go. But that only took us a couple extra minutes. You're going to whisk these 3 ingredients together and get them fully incorporated. And this is like starting with a cup of your Irish wholemeal flour. So you can see it's definitely a little bit darker and grittier than even the whole wheat flour that we might be used to. Now we are going to add some white flour into this so that we have a combination of the 2. It's a great thing to remember that you can do, right, when you're making recipes like this. If something calls for white flour, oftentimes you can add some whole wheat flour, do maybe 50-50. This is a cup of regular white flour, so regular white all-purpose flour. When you're using a cup like this, it's nice to scoop into the cup. It gives you a more even measurement. So I'm going to scooping in using my 1/4 cup measure, and then I'm going to level it off. Let's make sure that you don't get any air pockets. If you scoop a big cup like this into your flour bag, oftentimes you can get air pockets, and that will mean that you're not going to get exactly the right amount of measurement. If you're someone who likes to be very exact with baking, you can also use a gram scale, which is convenient when you're using European recipes. Just going to finish this measurement right here and level it off right into my sink to save a little bit of mess. So off that goes. and it goes in mixed with my other flour. So basically now we have like 50% Irish wholemeal flour, 50% white flour combination. So I'm gonna integrate these together, and then we're gonna be adding our next two ingredients, which is a half teaspoon of salt and a half teaspoon of baking soda. So as you know, anytime you're baking, right? I like to call cooking is an art and baking is a science. So you don't want to substitute ingredients that you don't understand the purpose of. So both the salt and the baking soda have very specific purposes in terms of the baking and in terms of how the density of your product will come out. So I like to use this little salt grinder. It's a great little nifty tool. I actually got this one for my husband a number of years ago at a cooking store, but I recommend them to clients. You can find them on Amazon now. You can just look up salt grinder or pump and grind is what it was called when I bought it. The reason I really like using this is because I do like the big grains of salt. We buy the Baleen sea salt grains, which I think have a nicer flavor. But it's so, such a big kind of coarse piece of salt. You really don't want to use that. It's fine if you're sprinkling meat, but let's say you're putting this into baking, you could end up with a real salty bite and something that you actually want to be a little bit sweet. These are quite savory, but this grinder grinds the salt so that it's nice and fine. So I can get a perfect measurement of my half teaspoon using my grinder. Perfect. I'm gonna add that in. And then I need a half teaspoon of my baking soda. So again, if you don't know this, on your baking soda box, after you fold it, you can use it to scrape the side of your spoon to level it off. So half a teaspoon of baking soda. I'm going to mix this all together again. And then, as you know, with baking, we have to add our wet ingredients to our dry ingredients, right? So the wet ingredient we're going to be using here is buttermilk. If you haven't used buttermilk before, it's a great ingredient for baking. It's not a one-to-one replacement for milk necessarily. They have a very different kind of mouthfeel. So if you're cooking actually in Ireland or in England, they have something called sour milk that you can use. The buttermilk is a little bit kind of creamier and richer, but you could use this instead of regular milk in pancakes, in muffins. It does add like a little bit of this kind of cultured sourness. That sounds like a bad description, but it is a nice flavor. And you'll see when I pour it out, it just looks a little bit different than typical milk bowl. The color is a little bit different. So we're going to be using, so this recipe calls for a cup of buttermilk and then to add by the tablespoon if you need more. And this is really kind of the interesting and maybe a little bit tricky part of this recipe. So I want to make sure to demonstrate it for you. So we've got, so you can see it's thicker than regular milk. So we've got a cup of buttermilk. And because I've already made these, obviously, I know that we're going to need a few more tablespoons. So first thing I'm going to do though is integrate and mix this together. I'm going to use a spatula to do that. So when you're mixing the flours, I definitely recommend a whisk, but when you're integrating the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients, I would use a spatula or a large spoon. So we're going to start this process just like any type of baking. You want to be careful not to over mix, but you want to make sure all the ingredients are integrated into one another. Now I have one last secret ingredient that I'm going to grab in a second, but I want to get this integrated first so I can show you the consistency and you can see what I mean about maybe needing a little bit more of the buttermilk. So this is pretty mixed. So a couple of things to notice. One, as I lift the batter up, there's excess powder beneath that I can't integrate in, right? You can see some of that excess flour. Can't integrate in because there isn't enough liquid left, right? So these are meant to be, they're not meant to be super liquidate. It shouldn't be like a muffin mixture, right? You're not putting it into a cup or anything like that. These are gonna stand on their own on the baking sheet when we cook them, but I need all of this powder to get integrated. So I'm gonna be adding in basically a tablespoon at a time. So we'll do 1, 2 tablespoons of our buttermilk. Mix this together. I want to get the right consistency before I add my last ingredient. And also I've got a very special trick for that last ingredient to make it nice and convenient. So mixing this in, and basically the way that it's described in the recipe, and I think that's a good description, it's like a little wet and gloppy is kind of how this should look, right? So you want it to be almost like Play-Doh texture. Let's see if I can come up with a better, almost like molding clay. So you can see it's starting to form a ball, right? It's not all completely stuck together, but you can see how if molded, you could kind of set this on a baking sheet and it would be able to bake independently. Now, we've got one last ingredient, and I didn't have it out here for a very specific reason. And I'm going to show you and tell you why. So I'm going to walk over to my freezer and grab the stick of butter that I put in here this morning. So integrating butter into recipes is really important. You want to make sure that that fat is spread throughout. Anytime you're making anything that you're going to bake, and it's going to be in individual servings, right? Or even in a cake that you're going to cut into and it's going to have individual servings, you want to make sure that all those ingredients are completely incorporated. Now, butter can be tricky because unless you melt it, right, which sort of changes the purpose that it provides within the recipe, will also make the ingredients more liquidy, which is not what we're going for. Unless you melt it, it's very difficult to integrate. So we need a tablespoon of butter. Let me show you a trick for how we're going to get it nicely integrated into our recipe. I'm going to use a microplane. This is a grater that you can use. I use this for garlic, for ginger, for baking with butter. You can use it for zesting limes and lemons. It's a very convenient and inexpensive kitchen tool to have. Definitely recommend picking one up if you don't have one. Now, why did I freeze the butter? Hopefully this is starting to come together, right? If your butter is too soft, it's going to be almost impossible to grate it. Now, oftentimes when you're baking, you want your butter at room temperature, because if you're using a stand mixer or your very strong arm, it will be a lot easier to mix the butter into sugar, let's say, and beat in eggs if the butter is soft. This is why it's always valuable to read your whole recipe before you get started. Because when I made these the first time this morning, I'd forgotten to throw my butter in the freezer, as I always do when I make this recipe. And I realized very quickly as I grated, you really want the butter to be a little bit even more solid than just refrigerator temperature. So I've got my butter nice and frozen. I'm using unsalted butter here. I'm going to use a tablespoon of butter, so you can easily see kind of where the tablespoon line is on your butter stick and know how much you need to grate into this to get it incorporated. So it's still going to get soft as it hits that grater, but it's going to grate much more easily than it would if it were at room or even fridge temperature. So what I love about butter is I can check my little measurement. Need about 1/4 inch more. All right. We're bringing it over so you guys, oh my God, you can see from here. It's like perfectly shaved butter. So cool, right? Another thing that I really like to doing this for is putting butter on a garlic bread, or on, if you're serving like baked potatoes. Just a nice cool trick. It's like a little visual, makes it a little bit more interesting, but it's also just a great way to get butter integrated into a recipe very easily. So we've added our butter in. So I said, oh, amazing idea. Frozen butter, right? Yes, scones do not have eggs. This actually makes them a very easy recipe for people that have egg allergies. Very easy and convenient. So we've got our shaved butter right in there, right? And we're going to mix it and integrate it in. So you can see why I wanted the recipe to be a little bit mixed before I put the butter in, because I was just fearful it wouldn't integrate evenly. Whereas now, yeah, because it's in small pieces, it's really easy to mix in evenly within the entire recipe. So we've got our, yeah, this dough is looking perfect. Okay, so this is how it should look. Kind of a little bit like if you can picture like a whole grain pizza dough, right? Definitely not soupy. I like wet gloppy mess. I think that that's a pretty good description from Spit and Kitchen. So I'm going to move some of our ingredients over for a second. Now there are a couple different ways to bake these, and some of it just really depends on what you're using them for. Deb goes old school style. And she just kind of does a big plop on a pan and then puts them in the oven. They take about 15 minutes to bake. Another way to do this is you can actually get something called a scone cutter, which it's basically like a circular cookie cutter. So I'll show you guys what it looks like, but it's basically the size of about a half measuring cup. You could also very easily just use the top of, actually, we're going to do this. So you don't need a muffin tin, you don't need the little paper muffin cups. So a couple different ways you can do this. One would be to use a kind of a mason jar lid, or to use I would say like a half cup measuring cup to measure your kind of scone amount in. So we have a prepared baking sheet here. I like to use parchment paper just because it's easy, it's inexpensive. You're not going to need to grease this, which is another huge convenience, and also keeps these really healthy. But the other thing that you could use, if you don't have parchment paper, you don't like to work with it, you could use a silicone baking sheet. If I'm baking something that has a very kind of particular flavor, I do like to have something down on my baking sheet. I use my baking sheets for meats, for dinners, for vegetables, right? So I don't want the scones or whatever else I'm baking to take on any of that flavor. So when I'm making cookies, I very typically use a silicone cookie sheet. I can show you what this looks like. When I'm making things like scones, I use the parchment paper. So these are from Amazon, silicone baking sheets, very inexpensive and very convenient, easy to clean as well. So we're gonna stick with our parchment paper for today, right? And like I said, there's a couple different ways that you can shape these depending on the recipe that you use. So Deb's method is pretty simple and quick and does not require a lot of work, which, you know, I love inherently. So you're gonna get your half cup scoop. So her recipe makes 4 scones. That means that they're pretty generous in terms of their size, right? So you take it, and you kind of plop. The idea is that they're a little almost like uneven, gives them kind of their unique beauty, all right? So that's the Deb method. Take one, plop it onto the pan. Like I said, her recipe calls for 4 scones. I'll show you the completed view of them in just a second. Another way that you could do it is take a little bit of your dough and place it on your tray. And then you kind of mold it into this mason jar lid. And I'll show you in a second what this looks like. It just gives you almost more of like a little patty. There's no wrong way or right way here. It really just depends on what you're doing. If you're looking to make these for a big group, I would probably do the second method, right? Which is more of the wholesome Ireland method. They come out to be a little handheld. They're great for kids. They're also recommended for baby-led weaning if you have very, very little kids. If you're serving adults, the Deb method is nice because, as you're going to see in a second when I show you the finished product, when you break these open from the Deb method, there's so much airiness inside that is really kind of a great vessel for that jam and butter, which scones are so lovely for. So whichever way you choose, you're going to get these out on your pan. I'm going to go for Deb method just for the sake of time. I want to show you that finished product. And again, you don't need to grease this cookie sheet. You can just put these right on. That's the beauty of working with parchment paper. And you can make kind of one more little mini one. Lost a little bit of dough to the example there. But these are going to be beautiful. I have to say, of all things you bake, they don't look super beautiful when they're going into the oven, but I can tell you they're going to be beautiful when they come out. So, rinse my hands here. In they go. So these bake for about 15 minutes. What you're looking for is for them to be just browned on the bottom and around the edges. I'm going to show you in a second. Always set your timer for baking. None of us can keep track of 15 minutes, right? So you don't want to run out of time and potentially lose your beautiful creation. So these are the scones that I made this morning. So you can see their shape doesn't really change much as they get baked. This is that light brownness that you're looking for on the bottom side. You can see when you break these open, they're nice and light inside, lots of little air pockets, but the outside is really nice and crunchy. So what I would recommend you do with these is you can either wrap them in some foil and just heat them up in the oven before you serve them. They really are the best just baked. So whoever happens to be nearby and wants to stop over in the next 15 minutes, these are going to be ready to go. I'm going to put, someone asked the temperature. So it's 375, 15 minutes. So they are really the most fantastic. They've just come out of the oven, but you can see like on this one, you can see a little bit of almost, you might not be able to see the detail, but like a little bit of the butter that just melted right in there. So I would either bake these, like you can see, they took so quick, 20 minutes to come together. So I would either bake them right when you're having guests over, right before you're about to have a beautiful brunch or breakfast, right before you're about to start your St. Patrick's celebration, or I would bake them in advance and then wrap them up in a little bit of foil, put them into the oven at around, 200, 225 degrees, and just let them heat through so they're warm. You could also pop them in a little toaster oven. That would help warm them through as well, and then they'll be good to go. I love mine with a little bit of raspberry or blackcurrant jam, just a touch of butter, helps to bring a little bit of flavor. They're also really nice with almond or peanut butter. You can make them almost into a little kind of peanut butter and jelly sandwich if you slice them through. Variations here, you can add sesame seeds on top, you can add nuts, you could add some little chocolate chips, you could add dried cranberries or raisins or currants, a lot of variations you can do if you want to kind of change up your flavor profile. So I want to bake mini cinnamon chips in them. Oh my God, that's such a great idea. I love that idea. Mini cinnamon chips would be absolutely fantastic in there. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Just a fun little celebration. Can you send the recipe, please? Yeah, so I'm gonna post 2 recipes right now. The first recipe is the one I followed most closely, which is from Deb at Smitten Kitchen. There you go, it's called Castle Breakfast. You'll see that there is a variation if you can't find the Irish wholemeal flour. It's very difficult to find. Even the American version of it tends to be overly ground. So I do recommend following the note that she puts in this recipe to make your own Irish wholemeal flour. We did that with a combination of whole wheat flour, wheat germ, and then she calls for wheat bran. I see, it's not going to everyone. Here we go. Okay, there is the first recipe. I'm gonna put in the second. There we go. So you can see in the second recipe, she makes the same statement about the Irish wholemeal flour. Difficult to come by, you can make your own. There's also something called like strong white flour. Anytime that you're making a recipe, if you can't find the specific ingredient, I do really recommend going to a cooking site and looking for substitutes. I had a feeling flaxseed was gonna work well, and it really did. The nuttiness flavor came through. It also had some added health benefits that added some poly and monounsaturated fats, making these even healthier. So they're being baked 375 degrees, for 15 minutes. And I think that handles all the questions that you guys had there. For those that came in late, for grating the butter, I highly recommend putting your butter in the freezer and let it get nice and cold before you put it onto the thin microplane grater. So thank you all. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll stay on for another minute or so. If not, happy upcoming St. Patrick's Day. I hope that you try these brown butter scones. They are a really healthy, delicious addition to any breakfast. Very easy to make, even on a quick weekday weekend morning, or have a bunch and you can kind of heat them up. So enjoy. You're welcome. I'm so glad. Thank you everyone for joining, and hope to see you next time.